I am a professor of history, and I cannot resist but giving a history lesson when I see people sitting either next to tables or especially in rows. Because I think that much of what happens today and a lot of issues which are connected to the future solution of the conflict in Israel and Palestine is connected to the history of the place, and more importantly, to the way that history is understood, articulated, and engaged with. I thought that the best way of doing it is to point out to several mythologies which in my own state are regarded almost as sacred historical facts, and which I, to the great displeasure of my family, decided to debunk and challenge. And I would enumerate some of these foundational mythologies, put across my own understanding of that mythologies based on my professional research, and hopefully we'll have enough time to conclude with some reasonable analysis of what the new perspective on history tells us about the present and the chances for a future solution in Israel and Palestine. A very famous mythology in Israel is that Palestine was a land without people, waiting for people without land. I'm sure that doesn't sound too unfamiliar to people in this country. And it took a while for me and others to try and convince the Israeli academic community. It was much easier to convince the more global academic community that Palestine was not an empty land when the first Zionist settler arrived there in the late 19th century. When they arrived in Palestine, the Palestinians were already enjoying a thriving cultural, social, and economic life. They were not yet defined as Palestinians, that is true. Nobody was defined in national terms in the late 19th century. There were, it is also true, citizens or inhabitants of the subjects of the Ottoman Empire, but nonetheless they already had their own characteristic as a nation, and had Zionism not arrived in Palestine, they would have become just another Arab national movement like the Syrians, the Iraqis, the Moroccan, and the Algerians. Jews may have felt that there were people without land. This is also questionable, but I won't go into that. But at least one cannot say that they arrived at an empty land. So that's one very important mythology. If you look at Israeli textbooks today in high schools, if you listen to the way history is narrated in official ceremonies, or how it appears in the discourse of politicians, surprisingly, this mythology still appears in a very forceful manner and is, to my mind, not very helpful for pushing forward the chances of peace and reconciliation in Israel and Palestine. The second mythology was that the Palestinians, from the very beginning, rejected the Zionist movement on religious grounds, were only employing violence against the attempts of Jews to save themselves from the horrors of Europe before and during the Holocaust. The way Ariel Sharon used to say, Palestinian terrorism started in 1882. I think this is a false description of the impulse of the Palestinian, both as a society and as a political leadership, towards the unexpected, vast immigration of Jews from Europe into their homeland. Palestinians, like most Arabs, are very hospitable people, and the initial reaction in the 1920s to the mass immigration of Jews, most of them very poor Jews, was to welcome them as poor people, allow them to be part of the society. What they did not accept was when it became clear, more or less in the late 1920s, that these settlers don't want to be guests, they want to be the owners of the house. And not just the owner of the house, they want to be the exclusive owners of the house. So yes, Palestinian resistance started there and then, but it was a very legitimate resistance against colonization of their own homeland. Not every act the Palestinians took was justified, not every political decision that they have made before the creation of the State of Israel was wise, but all in all, questioning the moral foundation of the Palestinian right to resist or to demand self-determination in their own homeland is, I think, wrong. The third point I would like to make is about the end of the mandatory period, the end of the British rule. Of course, that particular year, 1948, which ended the British rule in Israel and Palestine, is the most interesting year for an historian. Because for the Israelis, this is almost a miraculous year. This is the year when 2,000 years of Jewish exile have ended, and something incredible has happened when Jews could have their own homeland and build their own state. For Palestinians, there couldn't be a more catastrophic year. This is the year in which they have lost their homeland, their houses, their hopes to thrive as human beings and as a nation. Not very many junctures in history have such two striking historical understandings. And I belong to a group of Israeli historians who, until the Israelis made their archives accessible, were quite convinced that the Israeli Jewish perspective on this year was the correct one. But the Israelis' own archives show, actually, that the Palestinian catastrophe, or as the Palestinians call it, the Nakba, in which they lost half of their villages, half of their towns, and half of their country's population, that this was not a result, as Israeli mythology would put it, because of their foolishness or because of the fact that they rejected a very reasonable solution produced by the United Nations to partition Palestine between the Jews and the Palestinians. I think what the Israeli documents show very clear, that regardless of any solution, the Zionist understanding of how to create a Jewish state was that if you want to survive, and far more so if you want to thrive and prosper, you need as much of Palestine as possible with as few Palestinians in it as possible. And that realization that if you wanted to be a Jewish state and at the same time a democratic state, you could not allow yourself not to be the demographic majority. I always say to the Palestinians, you have been much better off if the Jews would have not dreamt about a democracy. Because they were so obsessed with the idea of democracy, they said, we cannot allow a state in which we are not the majority. But in 1948, the Jews were just 1/3 of the population. Now, I'm sure you can all think of all kinds of ways of how do you settle the problem that you want to be a majority in your own country, but you're only 1/3 majority. There are probably few ways of doing it. What the Zionist movement decided to do is to expel the Palestinians so that the Jews would become a majority and the dream of a Jewish democracy would not be undermined. There are several mythologies that continue out of that history of 1948, but I do think it's very pivotal. It's a very pivotal event. And rereading that event would explain much better the Palestinian position ever since 1948. Another set of mythologies that stem from Oslo, and I think are bringing us closer to our time, is that the Palestinians, in the words of the former Israeli Foreign Minister Abba Eban, have never missed an opportunity to miss an opportunity for peace. This is based on the idea that there were equal partners to the process, and that their proposals for peace, whether before or after Oslo, catered not only to the Israeli national interest, but also to the Palestinian national interest. In fact, that's the tragedy of all the history of the peace process since 1947, since the partition resolution. An old American idea of political science is informing the peace efforts towards Israel and Palestine. That if you want, as an outside negotiator or mediator, to try and help the two warring parties to reach an agreement, you should never take too seriously the point of view of the weaker party. Don't invest any attempt to understand their point of view. Don't regard their point of view as very significant. What you have to do is find out what is the consensual position of the stronger party. In this case, in 1947, the Zionist movement, and after 1948, Israel. Almost everybody supports the idea of the two states, and we are not even nearer to that idea with all the might that is behind it. And maybe that's a good moment in history to say, maybe there's something wrong with this paradigm. Maybe this idea that you can all the time only regard the national interest of one side and totally disregard the ambitions, the aspiration of the other side is not the right premise for reconciliation. Maybe the idea that you can allow one side to continue to occupy, to colonize, to expel, to demolish, and at the same time regard that same oppressive side as a legitimate peace partner is also not a fair and good paradigm for peace. Maybe peace is yet not on the agenda. What is on the agenda is the end of oppression, the end of colonization, the end of dispossession. Once dispossession ends, then a genuine peace process can begin. The Palestinians would have an agency as well. They would have to tell the third generation of Jewish settlers how do they see them in a future Israel or Israel and Palestine or whatever would be the name of a new political outfit. But they cannot be asked to elaborate this agency before the oppression and the occupation and the daily abuse of human rights and civil rights has come to an end.
How significant is the sort of Holocaust mentality in terms of the, as a reference point, in terms of the Israeli psyche?
I think it plays a very important role, objectively, of course, because it was a horrific, traumatic event, but also because it is constantly manipulated. And for me, the most destructive aspect of the manipulation of the Holocaust memory in Israel is the clear association that is being made between what the Nazis did to the Jews and what the Palestinians represent. In fact, every way you look at it in Israel, if it's the Holocaust Museum in Jerusalem, the educational system, the way that the Holocaust is memorized in schools, there is a clear connection between the Nazis and the Palestinians, namely, you don't want it to happen again because you're facing another potential destructor. And I think this is really corrupting the soul of the Israeli Jews in a way that not only makes peace impossible, but really does not allow for a normal society to develop and prosper. The first assumption that Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East, I think, does not tally the facts on the ground. Until 1967, Israel imposed military rule on 20% of the population, the Palestinian citizens of Israel. Military rule means that these citizens have had no basic human rights or civil rights. If 20% of the population by law is not entitled to any right, you cannot call a country a democracy. Since 1967, that same regime is imposed on the Palestinians in the West Bank and until recently on the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. A democracy cannot be a country that for more than 45 years does not grant even the most elementary human and civil rights to the Palestinians. So I think one should redefine Israel. It's not a democracy, it's an ethnic state that plays sometimes the democratic game, but unfortunately there is a kind of fatigue in Israel now, and even that game is not play.
It seems to me that if you had simply analysed these documents and reported what they indicated without describing the actions in the way that you did as ethnic cleansing, then perhaps you would not find yourself in the position that you find yourself in today. I'm not saying that you should have pulled your punches, but I just wonder whether that is the critical point in terms of the negative reaction to your whole analysis.
I agree. I don't think the debate in Israel between people like me and most of the society is a factual debate. It's a moral debate. I think that going into a village in 1948 and expelling everyone who lived there is immoral. And no reason in the world would justify such an act. Most of the Israeli Jews would say, our knowledge or our fear that they would have done the same to us justify what we did. I don't accept it. Especially I don't accept it if the whole idea of the Jewish state was conceived by the Western world in order to atone for the Holocaust. That definitely is not the way to say, here is how we universally memorize one of the worst genocides, and here is how we're going to stop the next genocide, by dispossessing the Palestinians. This is unacceptable philosophically, morally, and also ideologically. In a way, less maybe relevant, but it's very interesting. I don't know if you noticed that at least most Western journalists, not all of them, are using Jerusalem as a base for which to report what goes on in Egypt, in Jordan, in Syria, in Lebanon. Israel, using Edward Said's ideas, is not just a Western bastion in their eyes, it's an Orientalist state. It is the state that explains the Orient to the rest of the West. I think that one has to understand that American support for Israel is really based on a triangle that has sort of three legs to it. One leg is Christian Zionism. In fact, this is the oldest leg that informs American policy. People tend to forget how crucial Christian Zionism is in the life of American politics. Their conservative estimates of their numbers are 5 or 6 times more than the number of Jews who support pro-Israeli policies by the United States. It's a very formidable source. The other leg is the Jewish lobby, of course, that was built in the days of President Truman, which is a very interesting historical period to go for in order to understand American policy, because, not Truman, I'm sorry, President Eisenhower. President Eisenhower changed the American policy towards Israel and Palestine. He was about to pressure Israel to allow the return of the refugees, which really have enhanced enormously the chances of peace in Israel and Palestine. And he was in many ways rejected by the creation of the Jewish lobby. But I think the Jewish lobby power has really petered out in many ways, because the younger generation of Jews, for very egotistic reasons, do not feel committed or do not think that part of their identity connects necessarily to Israel. They feel very, very American. The third leg is the leg of the military-industrial complex that has its own agenda. And even there, I can see changes. I don't think Israel is anymore such a great industrial or military asset, given the other options that the Arab world is offering. So I think much of what remains is Christian Zionism, is part of that chapter in American history, which I don't think will continue for too long. I'm in a very optimistic mood today. The food was excellent. Your second question, I think the most dangerous idea an Israeli Jew can put forward is that a wish to see Israel as a genuine democracy. This is very dangerous to anyone who is a Zionist, and they really regard this as tantamount to suicide if Israel would become a genuine democracy. I think this is not dangerous. I think this is really the only hope for everyone who lived there and used to live there. Thank you.